Thank you, Heath. It's a great pleasure to be here at Northwood. I've been here many times for different reasons, but very glad to be here with you today. And speaking of today, it reminds me of the two guys that were on the golf course, and it was pouring down rain while they were on the green putting out, and one of them said to the other one, "I told my wife you'd have to be crazy to go to church on a day like this." So this is one of those days where you got to be crazy to come back to church on an afternoon with sunshine and so forth. So I very much appreciate your being here and taking part in this seminar. So we'll see where it goes and what's most interesting to you. This is a topic that I continue to be very much interested in, and that I think has just a huge implications for the life of this church that we love, the whole Christian church, disciples of Christ, and in fact the whole body of Christ in all of its expressions. It's good to see Lester here always. Great partner in general ministry through the years, and I always delight in being here with him and other friends who are in the room today. And Heath and I have become friends over the course of the last couple of years, and I very much appreciate him and his spirit and what he seeks to bring to the church. So thanks, Heath, for the opportunity to come and be here today. Let's look at the first slide here. The progressive church, and these days we tend to use the word progressive rather than liberal, in part because the word liberal has sort of been taken over by the politicians. But the disciples would be a part, I think, of what most any person would call the progressive family of the church. And we're in trouble. We have right now about half as many people in this church as we had in 2003 when I left office as general minister and president. Hard for me to believe it's been 20 years since I was GMP, but it has been. It's easier for me to believe that in the morning when I first get up and everything's creaky and groany, but it's been 20 years. We're not half the size we were in 2003, I think, because of anything I did right or wrong. There's something much larger going on in the culture as a whole. And in spite of the fact that we met our goal of starting 1,000 new congregations of disciples between the year 2000 and 2020, we're still half the size we were in 2003, which makes me very grateful we had that goal, because I think what would be our size if we didn't have those 1,000 new congregations? Many of our congregations have fallen below the threshold of full-time ministry. I can remember the day, and all of you can certainly remember the day, when we had lots of congregations, including Northwood, that had 2, 3, even 4 ministers on staff. And there were several hundred people attending worship. And we're now to a place where you can just about count on 2 hands how many congregations are that large now. So many of our large congregations have shrunk down to the place where they are 1 minister staffs, and some have gone beyond that to where they in fact don't have a full-time minister, or they're served by a bivocational minister, someone who does something else as well as ministry, which is good ministry. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just pointing to the fact that we've been losing members very rapidly. Many of, well, I said that about multiple staff. The average age of our congregants has risen from somewhere around 50 well into the 60s. So most disciples' congregations, if you visit today and you look around, you see a lot of people who look like me. I'm 75, or maybe look like you. I don't know how old you are, and I won't ask. But the point is, our average age is getting much older. Next slide. If misery loves company, then I suppose it's good news that we are not alone. This is true of every one of the mainline denominations in the United States. It's also true of nearly every mainline voluntary organization in the United States. So if you look at Rotary or the Kiwanis or the Eagles or the Masons or any of those service clubs, fellowship clubs, you see the same kind of phenomenon going on there as is going on in the church. And yet, even though this is true of every mainline denomination, it's not true of every mainline congregation. So Mindy and I have been attending at Central Christian Church downtown for the last 20 years, and that church actually has doubled in size over the course of the last 20 years. So it's not true of every congregation. I think there's more going on there than just dumb luck, although there's probably some dumb luck involved also. And we might talk about that a little bit more later, why some congregations seem to be thriving in the face of this overall denominational, shall we say, bad news. Northwood is a case in point. So using yearbook figures, I found that in 1992, there were 573 participating members at Northwood, and average worship attendance was about 173. And that's about the typical proportion of people worshiping to participating membership in those days. About 1/3 is typical. By 2002, 10 years later, participating members had dropped to 206, and average worship attendance was down to 131. Now, my guess is part of that was whoever was minister in 2002 may have been a little tougher on the participating members than maybe some other ministers were. And it's kind of a participating membership is kind of a subjective number. Worship attendance is not so subjective. They're either there or they're not. If you count them, you know how many people showed up for worship. Participating membership, though, some ministers want to make that only those who are really regularly engaged and so forth. Other ministers, I saw somebody at Kroger the other night who's a member here, so we'll count them as participating members. So that's a little subjective. But worship attendance is not very subjective. That you count. So 20 years after that, worship attendance stands approximately at 46. Now, I don't know if that's a good number right now or not. Probably in the ballpark. With COVID, things got pretty weird there for a while in terms of trying to count numbers. But you can see the trend at Northwood. So this would be a pretty typical trend for most congregations of disciples, and that would be true whether we're talking about rural churches. My family on my mother's side came from Hillsboro Christian Church. If you know anything about Hillsboro, it's about 50 miles west of here, just beyond Crawfordsville. Yes, all right. That's right. We found we were both born in Crawfordsville. Hillsboro Christian Church closed about 3 years ago after a long, steady decline that looks a lot like the decline we're seeing here. Now, I'm not saying that you're about to close. I'm just saying that that kind of decline is something we see in rural areas like Hillsboro, as well as in county seat towns, which used to be a big part of our strength as disciples, as well as urban churches like Northwood. So it's pretty ubiquitous across the life of the church, with some exceptions. Why is this? Well, in the case of Northwood, as is true of most of those other congregations, wherever they're located, it's partly due in changes in terms of where members live. So my guess is back in 1992, when worship attendance was up close to 200, a lot of the members of Northwood still lived in the general vicinity of the church. But probably already the trend had begun of people moving away from Northwood out into the suburbs. So my guess is that you have a lot of people who come quite a distance to come to church these days. Is that right? Okay. And that makes it challenging, right? On race weekend, just forget it if you're coming from the west. But it also makes it challenging in the sense that people have to come further. It's more challenging to have night meetings because people don't want to be out that late, or they don't feel comfortable driving after dark. Lots of reasons why having the membership scattered out across the county or even beyond the county is a special challenge for the churches. So that's one of the reasons American society has just been so mobile. People have felt free to move. Another reason inside these individual congregations is that there's been very little change in the way those congregations structure themselves for their life together. Very little change in their methods, and very little change in their self-understanding. Let that sink in for a minute. So most of these congregations are still operating on what we call the attractional model instead of a missional model. Here's the difference between those two. The attractional model is the model that says, if we just keep our property attractive and we have people at the door to welcome people, not just to hand out a program, but to really make people feel welcome and so forth. And if we have a nursery that's really in good shape, and we have adequate parking, and we keep the grass cut and so forth, then people will be attracted to our church and will come. Versus the missional model, which acknowledges that the attractional model has not been working for about 50 years. And so the church has to be engaged, get out of its building and be engaged in the community in some strategic ways in order for their neighbors to even know the church exists. Okay? I used to be pastor at First Christian Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and it just irritated the life out of me when people would ask me where my church was, and I'd try to explain, well, it's at Calhoun and Pettit. Well, where's that? And finally, the thing that would identify it for them, oh yeah, there's a McDonald's just a half a block down the street. Everybody knew where the McDonald's was. Nobody knew where First Christian Church was unless they went there, even though it was a very attractive property and well cared for. So it's not enough to hope that people will come and see you, because we no longer live in a churched culture, right? We now live in an unchurched culture. And so they really have no more thought of coming here to this church than I have about going to the Scottish Shrine downtown. I'm not a Mason. I don't want to be a Mason. I think Masons are probably great. My dad was a Mason. I think that's great, but I really have no interest in that whatsoever. And so it doesn't matter how attractive that building is, and it's very attractive. I've been there for purposes other than masonry. I'm just not interested in that. Okay? So, likewise with your church, no matter how attractive it is, younger people, and by that I mean about anybody under 65, is not going to be attracted to your church just because it's physically attractive, okay? Okay, we're going to say more about this later, as you might presume. And these congregations that are shrinking are still operating out of post-World War II assumptions. And we're going to say a lot more about that. So those are some reasons inside our congregations why they're shrinking. But there's some outside reasons that are much larger that we have to take seriously if we want to be sustainable as individual congregations, and especially if we want to be faithful as individual congregations. So outside things, there has just been, you may have noticed, a huge change in culture. And we're going to talk about what that change is today. There has been seismic shifts in worldview. People see things very differently today than they did in the post-World War II era. There's also been huge change in the perspectives of individual generations. Now, we're going to talk a lot about generations, and when I talk about generations, I'm talking on average around 20 years, but it's not just a biological definition. It's a sociological definition. So one generation differs from another, not just because they're different ages, but because they experience the world differently than the generation before them did. We'll say more about this, but just to give you a heads up. So when we use the word generation, we're not talking just biological, we're also talking what you might call a sociological definition of generation. We also are experiencing huge reaction right now to all of that change that's been going on in the world. It's resulted in what the press often calls culture wars, and we are in the middle of culture wars for sure right now, as we have forces that are progressive versus forces that are reactionary. Okay, so what's at stake here? I think there's a lot at stake. For one thing, I think the future of Christianity is at stake. Now, I'm a progressive Christian. I'm a disciple of Christ, so I think we make a big difference in the Christian world. Friends, if fundamentalism, to put it the way Harry Emerson Fosdick did back in the 30s, shall the fundamentalist win? If the fundamentalists win the day in terms of managing to cause Christianity to define itself in narrower and narrower terms, frankly, we could see Christianity winking out. it wouldn't be the first world religion that has died. And most often it dies, a religion dies because that religion refuses to adapt itself to what's going on in the world of now. Whether we're talking about Zoroastrians or we're talking about some other religion, I think Christianity itself is at stake. So let me put it to you this way. If you tell me as a 15-year-old or as a 40-year-old who is reasonably well educated that I have to believe in a 7-day creation story in order to be a Christian, friends, science is going to win that debate every time. Science is going to win. Young people are not going to give themselves to a faith that demands that you choose between religion and science. And as a disciple, I would say you don't have to choose between religion and science. They're actually very compatible if you're looking at religion not in the narrowest of terms, but in the broadest of terms. So I think the future of Christianity is at stake. We see this same, it may be easier for us to see this in Islam. We've all seen the destruction caused in the world by very fundamentalist Muslims, especially those in Saudi Arabia who were behind the bombings of 9/11 and who are behind ISIS and all of these other phenomenon that we've seen growing in recent years. Islam is in trouble because so many Muslims have taken seriously those fundamentalist groups that they find themselves having to get out of Islam altogether rather than embrace those very narrow definitions. And there are countries where if you can't embrace the narrow definition, which is the official definition for that particular nation, you can be arrested or persecuted. We're seeing the start of the same kind of stuff, in my judgment, in the United States, as we see the trend toward book banning and all the other stuff that we see going on in my home state of Florida and lots of other places around the country. There's a lot at stake in whether or not progressive Christianity is able to reproduce itself and to thrive in this current world. Today, a lot of people dismiss institutions, especially people under 65, have a tendency to dismiss institutions, including religious institutions, calling them useless or irrelevant, counterproductive. As we'll see, baby boomers tend to do this because they were lied to about the Vietnam War and because they recognize that all men are created equal was not truly functioning in the face of what was going on in Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma when baby boomers were growing up. It was a disorienting experience and finally an alienating experience for baby boomers. Now, I'm a boomer, barely, but I am a boomer. I was one of those that did not get the memo. I didn't know I was supposed to leave the church and forsake all institutional life. But a whole lot of people my age made that decision and have never gone back to church the rest of their lives. Even though they may consider themselves in some sense Christian or spiritual, they are not a part of the institutional church. So boomers do it because they felt betrayed by the government, the biggest institution of all, and then felt betrayed by all the other institutions in their lives. Gen Xers do it because they tried to fix the problems that they and the boomers saw in our institutions, including our religious institutions, and found they couldn't be fixed easily or quickly. So many of them walked away from institutions and are still very sour on institutions of all kinds, including churches. Generation Y, or millennials, do it because of their most cherished values not being reflected in most institutions, including the church, especially their value of diversity. So as soon as a millennial walks into a church and sees that it's not race-friendly, it's not ethnicity-friendly, it's not sexual orientation-friendly, any of that, the millennial, typical millennial, is out of there. Because diversity is one of the things that they value the most in human life. And finally, Gen Zers do it because they find religious doctrine irrelevant to actual life. They would be probably the quickest to say, 7-day creation story, literally? I don't think so. I don't think so. So, institutions have been having a rough time for the last 50 years. And we see this cynicism about institutions in the attitudes people have toward government right now, right? There's lots of people who feel that government doesn't work, can't work, won't work. And so many people deconstruct institutions, if you will, call them useless and counterproductive. Okay, let's go to the next slide here. And institutions are hard to change. We have to admit that. Oh, of course they're hard to change. They were created to preserve things. In that sense, institutions are pretty effective because they do preserve certain things. Things which are valuable to the people who have created or amended the institution over the years. Things which get expressed in particular forms and practices. As preservers of values, institutions are supposed to be hard to change. We make them hard to change. It's the same reason why in Congress, if you want to pass a simple bill, you do it with 51% of the vote. But if you want to change the Constitution, that's a whole nother process, because then you're talking about the fundamental values of the government, and those are hard to change. You got to have 2/3, you got to have the states involved, and so forth. So we expect institutions to be hard to change. As we used to sing in seminary, like a mighty tortoise moves the church of God. The church is not quick to change, and in many ways that's good. But it works against us when it comes to adapting ourselves to changes in the culture. And they shouldn't be impossible to change. So I submit to you that writing off all institutions as useless is as wrong-headed as blindly trusting institutions. Blindly trusting assumes the best will emerge without effort. The best will naturally become real, which is totally naive rather than faithful. Institutions require nurture and care and development. Next slide, yeah. A couple of examples of naivete that we see with us right now. The free market will naturally take care of all imbalances. Friends, there's no such thing as a free market, right? There has to be regulation, or you're immediately into monopolies and collusion, and you have to go through the whole cycle of reform again, of the economic system. Or trickle-down economics will naturally bring prosperity to all. That's an idea that's 40 years old now and has not borne fruit in 40 years. My friend, may rest in peace, Clark Williamson, had a definition of trickle-down economics, which was my favorite, which is, if you want the birds to have more food, feed the horses more grain. Meditate on that for a bit. It sounds like Clark, doesn't it, if you knew Clark? Okay. Next slide. The bottom line is, we need institutions. They can be useful tools. And we should neither dismiss them as useless nor trust them blindly. You can't trust them blindly because, as John Calvin said back in the 16th century, to paraphrase, we can't completely trust anything human, including our tools, and institutions are tools. You can't totally trust them, and yet you need tools. You need institutions. But they require nurture, care, and constant transformation. They're not like, well, they are in a sense like a top that you wind up and it spins and spins and spins, but eventually it spins down and falls over. You have to keep inputting energy into a top in order for it to work, and that's much the way it is with institutions. And for the church, this means they require effective, active leadership from both clergy and laity. But so many of our congregations are like tops that were set in motion in the post-World War II era and have really had no input since then. And so they've been slowing down and they begin to wobble and finally they fall over. I did church consulting after I stepped down as general minister and president because I was only 55, so I still had to make a living. And I enjoyed being a regional minister before that, so I thought, well, I can stay out of my successor's way if I do church consulting, especially if I do it ecumenically, not just among disciples. So that's what I did. So my favorite church consultant joke, ready? Favorite church consultant joke. I have good news and bad news. The good news is, if it's ever 1957 again, we're ready. The bad news is, it's never going to be 1957 again. Okay? All right. That's a year, by the way, that I was a charter member of a church in St. Petersburg, Florida, which has been wobbling for a couple of decades now. So for all of us as leaders of the church, and you're here today because you're a leader of the church, maybe you think of yourself as a past leader of the church, but I'm thinking you're still all leaders within this congregation, certainly. And so all of us in leadership have to take Matthew 5:3, I think, as our cue. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That always puzzled me for a long time because I thought, well, wouldn't God want us to be rich in spirit? Why would being poor in spirit be a good thing? But if you look at the Greek, what it really means is, blessed are those who recognize their spiritual poverty. Or most simply, blessed are those who recognize their need. As leaders, clergy and lay, we all have to work continuously at understanding what our needs are and what the needs of our institutions are. Okay. It really comes down, in many ways, to the question, is a particular congregation interested in the mission for which it was created, or has it reached a point where it's interested in its own survival? Jesus said, "Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." This turns out to be as true for institutions, including congregations and denominations, I might add, as it is for individuals. If survival becomes your goal, that will only hasten your demise as an institution. It is as we give ourselves away in mission, not necessarily foolishly, but as we give ourselves away in mission, that we find new life. Paradoxically, it's one of the great paradoxes of the New Testament. You got to die to live, continually die to continually live. Okay. Let me stop there because I've been preaching here for about 20 minutes, and I apologize for that. Probably more than 20 minutes. Yeah. Comments, questions, beg to differs, anything anybody wants to throw in here?
My feeling is that what's missing is the camaraderie and the love that we had for each other. And we took care of each other. And that was no doubt the mission, that we took care of each other in any way we could, shape, or form. So something had to take the place. With the younger people, they drifted into all kinds of what I would call wild substitutions, of replacing a sacred spot with an unsacred spot. And it happens every day. It's not only happened in churches, it happens in industry, it happens in medicine. And I fought the fight for 53 years of my patients being called clients instead of patients. And it drove me crazy. And so I tried to teach my residents the first thing they needed to know is how to love their patients and take care of them. No money, we're not in this for money, we're in this for service. And every day I walked in the office and I found a patient there that needed me that day for what I could provide. And it wasn't necessarily medicine, I just needed to listen and take care of them and love them. And in return, they loved me back. And I had satisfaction in my job, and I go in at 6 in the morning and leave at 9 o'clock at night because I couldn't get away, because something had to be done for training my residents, or taking care of my patients, or trying to get the medical school to value family medicine and not look down their nose at us. And that was a job. So, that has to happen across the board in every age, every place in our society. That has to come up. Service is the issue. And I think that if you do that, we'll fill it up. They'll come back in droves because what they're picking as a substitute kills them or destroys their lives, and not only their lives, but their health. They pick unhealthy things to do for substitutes. So I've been fighting this for 50-some years, and I need help.
Thank you. That's a great illustration there. If you missed the first part of that, he grew up in the church in Marion, Indiana, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ there, which was a cathedral church that is now gone. Much like what we were talking about earlier, so many churches that were high and mighty that are now struggling or gone altogether. And the problem, as he sees it as a physician, is that young people give themselves to negative forces in the absence of the church reaching out to them. The church, now these are my words, so you might say it differently, but the church became irrelevant to them in many ways because the church was not reaching out to them and meeting them where they were and bringing them into the life of the community. So it's true in medicine. His other example was his medical practice. It's as true in medicine as it is in religion. it's true in just about any walk of life that you can imagine. Yeah. Okay, other comments? Yes, sir.
Aren't we in trouble if we're just a progressive church? Well, I mean, reactionary, conservative, moderate, liberal, radical, progressive. If we only pick one of those people and add their label to us, haven't we already lost the game?
Yeah, that's good. Are we up the creek if we just identify as a progressive church? Yeah.
Lost some of those loyal, lucrative congregations. I'm thinking of the Church of Monticello over what shouldn't have been a controversial vote at all. So, whatever. And basically the region formalized the fact that no,
Oh.
then we need to get rid of those first.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, I'd say. If we are simply ideologically progressive, then we're digging ourselves a pretty good hole. We disciples pride ourselves on being inclusive and being diverse. And that diversity really gets tested, as it's getting tested in the nation as a whole right now, really. Can we embrace people who have a different point of view or different opinion about important issues? Can we continue to enfold them in our community and to love them and to be loved by them? Or are we going to be constantly drawing hard lines and saying, you're out? It's a great question. I think for me the answer is no, we can't do that. Or we are just digging ourselves a hole. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't ever take a stance on anything, either on one side or the other. It's simply to say that we have to maintain community and care for each other in the midst of our differences. What are the limits to diversity? That's a question I get a lot as a disciple leader. What are the limits of diversity? The limits of diversity basically are how much diversity can you tolerate? And does the church embrace, really not just include, but embrace people who are different? Or when we make those kind of decisions, do we push them out? If we push them out, then that's shame on us. Now, if they feel they have to leave because they can't in good conscience live with a decision that the rest of us have made, then that's a decision they have to make because that's their conscience. But if they leave because we stop caring about them, or we push them out, or we ostracize them because they had a different point of view, then that's a whole different definition of church. At that point, we've become more ideological, I would say, than progressive even. So it's a good question. Yeah.
You know, I thought religion is primarily lack of, not judgment, but love. And if we judge anything as being inferior, we stepped right behind the 8 ball and we're out. And if they pick that up, if our young people pick that up, they're going to be out. So we've got to change our attitudes, if that's it, or start doing a lot more acceptance and forgiveness across the board, and get involved in different social things in the community. We do a lot of things to help people, don't get me wrong. I go to Allisonville before I came over here with this beautiful lady. But I'm still a disciple, and I live my life. My mission with God was I would serve. And I was told, do it. And I did it in every way I can. And that's not dead. We just need to find it and bring it out and push it, and live it.
One way to talk about this, is to talk about the difference between doctrine and community. When we become so focused on doctrine, community suffers. if we become entirely focused on community apart from doctrine altogether, then there's nothing really to define the community much. So there has to be a healthy balance between those forces. Yeah.
That's okay. I'm not used to using mics anyway. I just wanted to say that it's been my experience in the last 5 years or so. I run into young people, like I have home health aides that come to help me. And so, like if they're in their 20s or something like that, like someone in particular I'm thinking of, knew nothing about, didn't grow up in Sunday school, didn't hear all the Bible stories. She's in her 20s, and we had discussions about church and stuff like that. It's really hard to speak about Christianity to someone that knows absolutely nothing. And I think there are a lot of people, younger people, that did not grow up in a family that took them to church, and they know absolutely nothing about it. And Christianity is really kind of complex in some ways, I've found, as I've gotten older. I mean, you can make it, the Bible stories for children, and then, I don't know, I kind of went away from the church myself when I was in college and came back at age 30. I was baptized at 11, and then there was a gap because I did not know how to walk as a Christian. And there were so many people around me that weren't, and I don't know, it was difficult. So anyway, I mean, how do you relate to people that know absolutely nothing about Christianity and don't see the value, and it seems very strange to them?
Well, you've named one of the things that we want to talk about in these two sessions. That is, how can we, in this case as Northwood, relate to other generations, some of whom have absolutely no Christian education in their background whatsoever. If you want to blame a generation for our problems, blame my generation, the boomers, because we were the ones that didn't stay and demand that the church change to meet our needs. We just left. So after we left, our kids weren't there, and their kids haven't been there. And so in many families, there's at least 2 generations that has never had any meaningful Christian education. Don't have the language, don't have the concepts. And in the meantime, the culture, which imperfectly, but in many ways did carry the message of Christianity, or some understanding of what Christianity is, the culture no longer does that. The culture no longer teaches our children any religion. So the church has to do that, right? I mean, there's nobody else to do it. No school district would ever try to do it, because as soon as they did, somebody would haul them into court. It can only be, and besides that, I'm not sure I want any government institution teaching my children the faith. That's my job, and that's the church's job. Okay, let's go on, and we'll come back to some of this, though. These are all spot-on comments that we need to address. If you think about the mainline denominations, go ahead to the next. A really important piece of self-understanding has to do with this phrase: where are you and what time is it? What I mean by that is, if your Christian faith was shaped in the 1950s or the 1940s, and you're still, religiously speaking, living in the 1940s or 50s, then you're really not here, religiously speaking. You're back there. You really need to have a faith that functions in the 2020s rather than in the 1950s. You with me there? But a lot of people never grow in their faith understanding after they're about 12 or 15. If they're lucky, they come back like you came back when you were 30. They come back and maybe get something more, usually because they encounter a church that is teaching a contemporary faith. And they learn that, and they update, and then they feel at home in the 2020s. But if you're still stuck in the 1950s, that's going to be a real problem for you personally, as well as make it difficult for you to relate to your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. Let's go to the next slide. The bottom line is it's essential to understand when and where we come from, and when and where those we wish to work with and minister to come from. It's one thing to say, as Northwood Christian Church, we should really reach out to people in our neighborhoods. There's a bunch of 20-somethings and 30-somethings and 40-somethings out there that really need Christian faith, and we need to reach out to them. But if what we are reaching out to them with is a 1950s faith, it ain't happening. They're not going to have any interest in what you're talking about. So we're going to take some time to understand when and where we each come from, okay, by looking at the different generations. Any of you see the movie or read the book, The Perfect Storm? Love that book. I showed my brother that movie, and he got really upset with me because he thought I was representing it as a true story in every regard. And as you know, if you saw the movie, at the end, the boat goes down, and there's a lot of speculation about what happens, but nobody really knows what happened because nobody survived. So there was nobody to tell the story. But it's a story about a fishing boat up in Massachusetts that got caught in a storm that was actually 3 storms that came together all at once. And if you read about that storm, which interestingly enough was named Grace, that storm Grace, there were waves so high that the buoys that they have out there to measure the height of the waves broke somewhere above 100-foot waves. So these were just incredibly large waves generated by these 3 storms that came together. A hurricane from the south, a low from the west, I believe, and a high from the east. These came together and created this incredible storm. Well, there's a sea change in culture which has brought about the social disestablishment of the mainline churches especially. So when I talk about the 1950s, some of you maybe would remember that when the National Council of Churches built a new headquarters building in the Riverside area of New York, President Dwight D. Eisenhower went and participated in the dedication of the National Council of Churches headquarters building. What do you think the chances are of something like that happening now? For one thing, the National Council went from a staff over 500 people at that time to a staff now of about 17. So there has been a disestablishment of mainline Christianity in the country. So the country no longer salutes Christian faith. And if it does, sometimes it can be in a pretty perverse way, but that's another story. Okay, let's go to the next. Another reason for this perfect storm is the obsolete nature of the organizational forms used by most of these mainline churches. We'll say more about that. And the resulting anxiety in these churches, which has turned so many of us inward toward maintenance and survival rather than mission. So somewhere around the early 1970s, in a lot of disciples' congregations, the adults started looking around and said, hey, wait a minute, where are the youth? We used to have a big youth group in this church. Where did they go? And they suddenly start studying themselves and realize there's hardly anybody that actually participates in the life of this congregation who's under 25. And 10 years later, there's hardly anybody in this church that participates that's under the age of 35. And 10 years later, there's hardly anybody in this church who participates who's under the age of 45. And so on. And as congregations begin to realize what's happening, collective anxiety grows. And anxiety really is an enemy in institutional life. When you get really anxious, that's when you tighten your grip on things and you get really concerned about survival. What happens when you get really concerned about survival? Not talking about sustainability, I'm talking about survival. What happens? You choke the life right out of that institution. Go back to Matthew 5:3, whoever seeks to save their life will lose it. We've been seeing a lot of that go on in the face of this perfect storm. Okay? Next slide. I've been talking about mainline denominations. Here are the 8 denominations that are generally considered the mainline denominations in the United States. The American Baptist Convention, not the Southern Baptist, but the American Baptist. Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the Episcopal Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, Presbyterian Church USA, Reformed Church of America, United Church of Christ, and the United Methodist Church. Most of these churches represent mergers that took place somewhere back in the 20th or even the 19th century. These are called mainline for a couple of reasons. One reason is because a journalist in Philadelphia noted that these were the brands of congregations that were located on the main line of the railroad track that goes into Philadelphia. Okay, that's where the term mainline maybe came from. But the philosophical background of this is that these were the denominations who were formative leaders of American culture until about 1950. And you look at the disciples and figure, well, we just came together as a group, as a movement in 1832, so the nation started in 1776. How could we have been formative? Well, we were formative from the time we began to get together. We began to be formative on the American Republic. We've had 3 presidents of the United States who came out of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Proportionately, that's about as many as, that's really more than any of these other churches when you look at our size compared to the number of presidents we've produced. Whether you like those particular presidents or not is another question. 3 of them came out of the Disciples of Christ. And we were formative in the ecumenical movement. Any council of churches that you can name in the United States or in the world, disciples were there at the beginning of those councils of churches because we've always believed in the unity of all Christians. And that was not always the case in the United States. When the United States began, the myth is, the tale we sometimes tell ourselves is that people came here to be religiously tolerant because there wasn't tolerance in Europe. It's not quite right. People came here so that they could express whatever religion they wanted to live, but they weren't necessarily committed to being tolerant of anybody else. So Massachusetts, for example, still had an official state church until the 1830s, long after the formation of the Constitution. So religious tolerance is something that developed over the years in the United States. Initially, we were all in competition with each other. Gradually, we became more cooperative with each other. The disciples of Christ can take a lot of credit for that. So that's just one way in which we've helped shape the United States. U.S. church membership of all denominations, mainline or otherwise, looks about like this. Now, it's hard to get really hard numbers, right, because they're based on preachers' estimates. And preachers' estimates aren't always necessarily very accurate, all right? But at the beginning of the United States in 1776 or thereabouts, about 10% of Americans claimed to be members of any religious denomination. That flies in the face of the notion that we were created as a Christian nation, right? We can say a lot more about that, but just say for the moment, about 10% of Americans at the beginning considered themselves members of any denomination. But that number steadily grew, and I think it probably steadily grew in part because the United States had a sort of a free market of ideas. So these churches were free to express themselves in any way they wanted to and to make their case to the public. Come be a part of us because this is what we believe. Because of that free marketplace of ideas, a lot of people did begin joining the church, and over the course of the first 100 years, a lot of people did, so that by 1860, about the time of the Civil War, about 35% of the American population actually belonged to one or another denomination. We see a dip here because of the Civil War. War is really hard on churches, partly because people get alienated by the realities of war, and partly because this war was fought on American soil, which meant a lot of churches got burned down, torn down, appropriated for other purposes, and so forth. But by the 1880s, we began to see the church growing again in the United States. So that around the time of World War I, we were at a place when about half of Americans belonged to one denomination or another. That's really a huge proportion when you look at most other Western nations in the world. But something happened. What happened right in that time frame right there? Historically, what was going on? World War I, that's right. World War I was an incredibly disillusioning war. It was going to be the war to end all wars, to make the world safe for democracy and so forth. We thought we were going to go to Europe, and in 6 months we'd have this thing mopped up and settle all this hash among these European powers. And we got over there and got bogged down, like everybody else, in trench warfare and lost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. And it was very disillusioning. And a lot of the church leadership of the day supported World War I, said, yeah, we ought to do that. And so when World War I became such a quagmire and didn't really have a very satisfactory ending, as we saw just 20 years later, World War II started up, basically finishing World War I because those issues hadn't really been settled in World War I. It was very, very disillusioning. And so people pulled away from public participation in all kinds of institutions, not just the church, but they pulled in from all kinds of institutions, pulled out. But then World War II started, and World War II was a different kind of war than World War I. There seemed to be a very clear purpose for American engagement. Namely, our own survival as a nation was on the line. So it was regarded as a good war, unlike World War I, which had been regarded as just kind of a quagmire with no good, solid outcome. And the churches supported World War II for the most part, with some dissonance. But when the war was over and the soldiers came home and people came home from the factories and the war effort in general, they did two things. One was they started having children in record numbers, and that was the builder generation, and they began building institutions for those children and for themselves. And so church growth just went wild. And we have huge numbers of congregations in the Disciples of Christ and in almost any church in the country that you can name that was alive at that time. Those denominations all have a lot of churches that were started in the late 1940s and in the 1950s and in the early 1960s. And it's all a reflection of this boom in numbers, but also boom in love for institutions that occurred after World War II, as a result of World War II. This went on until here, and the magic number is 1968, as we will see. 1968, it all came unraveled. Now, it didn't all happen in 1 year. There were a number of iconic things that happened in 1968 that many of us, most of us probably can remember. But it's kind of like when my family moved from Crawfordsville to St. Petersburg in 1957. As a 9-year-old, I thought, the instant you hit the Florida line, it's palm trees. But as we kept driving past the Florida line and going, more and more, northern Florida looked just like southern Georgia. And it wasn't for quite a while yet that we began to see naturally occurring palm trees. So these things it's kind of like that. These things don't happen overnight. It's not like a switch goes on. There's a transition period. So it didn't all happen in 1968, but that's kind of the iconic year because so much happened then. Some people would say 1964 was the year because that's when the Beatles came to the United States. Or they might name some other significant social event that really changed the culture. But 1968 is the year I like as sort of the iconic year of change. So, go back to that slide one more time. Ever since 1968, this is what participation in church life has looked like in the United States. Now, some denominations were growing in here. Most of them were very conservative denominations. But if you read church history, you see that very often the things that happened to the more progressive churches happened to the more conservative churches. They just happened 20 or 25 years later. So now we're seeing marked decline in the Southern Baptist Church, for example. And in a number of other conservative denominations that had been growing, we're seeing many of them now beginning to decline. So it's not because there's something fundamentally wrong about being who we are. It has to do with the change, the sea change in the culture as a whole, and it affects everybody. We need to take a break. Let's take a break and we'll come back and we'll begin to look specifically at some of these changes that occur in culture. Let's take just a few minutes, okay? An honest few minutes, and yeah. Thank you for coming back. So the question, of course, is how did it come to this? How did we get to this place where Christianity, in terms of numbers, is declining in the United States? Well, young people left our churches beginning in the mid-1960s as part of a new anti-institutionalism. I alluded to this before. Two of the major causes for this were the Vietnam War experience, in the sense that millions of Americans served in the military in Vietnam, and the government kept talking about this as a fight for freedom. But the more you learned about the government of South Vietnam, the more you realized that this was not really a struggle for freedom in the usual understanding of that word, not really a struggle for democracy. This was really an attempt to hold communism at bay, which was a different reason. But the administration, and that happened to be headed at the height of that war by a disciple, Lyndon B. Johnson, and I really prefer to remember Johnson for his anti-poverty programs and for his anti-racism rather than for his war policies, with which I vehemently disagreed as I was a college student in those days. But the Johnson administration could never give a straight answer about why we were sending troops to Vietnam. And the American public got onto that after a while, after we watched the body counts every night over dinner and so forth, and we got up to where we had 500,000 people on the ground in Vietnam. That was 1968. And the war was still going badly, and there was still no good explanation as to what we were trying to do there. So that all just went south. And it was very alienating, especially to those who fought in that war, because when they came home, you remember, they were rejected by the American public because they had been the ones fighting that very unpopular war. At least we learned something in that. We've treated our veterans since the Vietnam War much better than we did our veterans of Vietnam. Due to no fault of their own, they were fighting a war that was not popular. But this was all very disillusioning to young people, and I'm talking about people who were early boomers. And in a sense, early boomers never got over that. A lot of the people that you saw on January 6th at the Capitol were people who were still angry about those things, even though they couldn't identify maybe that as the reason for their being there. That was the beginning of their alienation from institutions in general, and especially from the government. But also there was the obvious hypocrisy in American life of the treatment of African Americans and other indigenous people. So we saw on television what was going on in places like Selma and Montgomery. We didn't see so much on television what was also going on in Chicago, although it was also happening in the North as well as the South, but most notably it went on in the South. And that was alienating, as people began to suspect that something was rotten. All of that together alienated young people so that they began to turn their backs on institutions. These were the same young people who had proudly worn their scout uniforms just 5 years before, and within 5 years, young people didn't want to be caught dead in a Boy Scout uniform or a uniform of any kind. And Scout participation took a nosedive, like all other institutions in the United States, when it came to young people. There were still older people in the institutions, but younger people left in droves. So it wasn't just the church, it was all the institutions. And our congregations didn't really respond to this very well. What we said was, well, they'll get over it, and in 10 years they'll have their own children, and they'll wonder what they're going to do with their kids, and they'll come back to get Christian education for their kids, and so this will all sort itself out. Didn't happen. For the most part, boomers never came back to the church in the numbers that they left. Some did, but most never really came back to the church. The world changed. The church didn't. Okay. So this 1968 year is, I think, the pivotal year in American history that's relevant to our conversation today. Next slide. And this is what we'll finish with today, and next week we'll look at particular generations and what shaped each one of those. But I want to hand these out. So if you go to the side that says modern versus postmodern culture, I should admit up front here that some people don't like the term postmodern. Some academics don't like the term postmodern, but I like it. And the reason I like it is because you know what I was talking about before, how you transition between Indiana and Florida, and it takes time for that transition to occur. Well, one era, like the modern era, doesn't all of a sudden switch overnight to the next era. There's a period of transition in there when the world is sort of finding out what's next. And 1968, I would say, was definitely the beginning of the end of the modern era. But I like the term postmodern because we can't really say what the next era is. It may be another 50 years before we know how to name that time, the post-1968 time. So in the meantime, we just know it's after the modern era. That's all we can say for sure. It's no longer the modern era. So for that reason, I kind of like that phrase, postmodern. So here's some differences that began to be impacting the culture. In the modern era, physical laws were understood to be immutable and absolute. So for example, a second is a second is a second, no matter where you are. A minute is a minute is a minute. An hour is an hour is an hour. But because of Einstein, who did his work in the 19-teens, but whose work wasn't really beginning to be understood by the popular mind until the 1950s and 60s, after the atomic bomb and so forth, and it got their people's attention. Relativity points out that actually physical laws are not as immutable as they seemed. So, for example, if you are next to something that has a lot of gravity, time is going to go slower than it is if you're far removed from gravity. Okay, so gravity actually makes time go slower. And the absence of gravity allows time to move faster. Yeah, this may not make much difference when you're going to Kroger's, but it makes a big difference when you're putting up satellites at 22,000 miles above the Earth's surface for purposes of GPS and for communications, beaming stuff from Europe to North America to Australia, whatever. That's a significant enough distance that this effect can be seen, so that the timing of those satellites at 22,000 miles has to be adjusted to match time as it occurs on the surface of the planet. Those adjustments are being made constantly. If they're not, then communication breaks down. Okay? So a minute at 22,000 miles above the Earth's surface is different than a minute on the Earth's surface. Like I say, that doesn't make much difference on a trip to the grocery, but it makes a huge difference if you were thinking that the world was full of absolutes that were the same every place in the universe at the same time. It just opens the door on an idea that was foreign to the modern mind. In the modern era, things were regarded linear. We saw things in linear ways and symmetrical. To put it another way, we like to have our ducks in a row. And we felt uncomfortable when our ducks got out of a row. We wanted things to be contained and in a row. But in the postmodern world, things are nonlinear, they're asymmetrical, and there are many foci. So if you could talk about the modern worldview as one like a target, where there's a bullseye in the middle, and then there's rings around that bullseye, and you're either closer or farther from that one focal point in the center. But in the postmodern world, things tend to be seen in terms of lots of different foci, some larger or smaller than others, and they're all interconnected. All of them are interconnected in a matrix. So you can see this in the business world as it's moved to more postmodern models. It used to be that there would be a headquarters in a single nation, and then there would be, if you will, satellite expressions of that corporation everywhere else. But all the communication came to the hub and then back out to the satellites. But now corporations are organized as matrices. And information flows in all kinds of ways between all of those different nubs and hubs. You following me here? And by the way, that's a pretty good description of the internet. The internet is not a place where there's a central hub and everything flows in and out of a central hub. In the internet, everything is connected to everything else. And there's lots of different foci. So if I'm looking up information about something, my query from my laptop doesn't go to Chicago to a relevant place someplace else where that information is. My query goes all across the net, and pieces and parts of that responses can come from any place and every place in the internet back to my laptop. In the modern world, the basis of human organization was the nation state. And so in World War I and World War II and all the wars before that, typically we saw nation states fighting against each other and nation states rising or falling. But in the postmodern world, largely because of satellites and because of the internet, there are at least 4 major organizing centers for human life. One still is nation states. Nation states are still important. But there's ethnic groups. Watch what's going on right now in the Ukraine, where ethnic Ukrainians are fighting against Russians who are trying to claim that Ukraine is really a part of Russia, and the Ukrainians say, no way, brother, no way, we're different. Or you look at a country like Yugoslavia, which a strongman was able to hold together as one country for a long time. But as soon as Tito, the strongman, died, it immediately shattered into all the various ethnic groups that have resulted in the new nations that we know of, places like Serbia and so forth. Mass communication. So it used to be that communication was done pretty much one-to-one. And then it was done by newspapers, so it was one to many. Now we have mass communication because of satellites that just dump huge amounts of information, some of it true, some of it not so true, on everybody at once. And it has a tremendous impact on how the world operates, right? So right now, due to mass communication, Target stores have seen a dip in their stock because a lot of people who are anti-gay resented the fact that they had merchandise that supported Pride Week, gay pride kinds of merchandise. And so a lot of people have stopped buying at Target. On the other hand, Walmart is advertising the heck out of their gay pride apparel and other paraphernalia this week because they're trying to get some of Target's customers to become Walmart customers instead. There's a million other examples that we could all come up with about how mass communication shaped the way we do life. And finally, the fourth factor is the market. So in the modern era, there was the London Stock Exchange and there was the New York Stock Exchange. And those were the two big stock exchanges in the world. But with satellites, then we had the rise of the Tokyo Stock Exchange and the Singapore Stock Exchange and a number of other stock exchanges. And so the way things operate today, through mass communication, word about some market force might start in London, but then whatever happens in London is heard and responded to by New York, and then is heard and responded to by Tokyo and Singapore, and back around the horn to Tokyo or to London again. So much of what goes on in the world today is economically determined by these markets. So you want to know why you're paying more for gas right now? It's because the world market for oil is being manipulated by oil producers. Some of them are companies with which we are familiar, but right now OPEC is meeting and talking about cutting back their production another another million barrels of oil a day because they want the price of oil to go back up. It's pretty low right now. Doesn't feel low to us, but it's pretty low in comparison to what we were paying a year or two ago. So OPEC is trying to manipulate the market. Has nothing to do with a nation state. Government can't do anything about that. No government can do anything about that. That's a market force. And it's globalized by mass communication and satellites, which are necessary for mass communication. Okay? So that's a huge difference in the world now from back in the time of, say, World War II, or even up any time before 1968. 1968 was about the time communication satellites became operative and global communications became effective. In the modern world, authority was granted by office. It was hierarchical. So if you were in a school system, the superintendent was the chief, and then the school principals were below that, and below that were the school teachers, and below that were the lowly students, right? So in 1955, Mr. Mann, that was my principal's name when I was in elementary school, and he looked the part. He's about 6 inches taller than I am now. And Mr. Mann caught me going sledding one more time down the hill after the recess bell rang. So I was the last kid to come back in after recess. And as I came to the door, Mr. Mann picked me up off the ground by my shirt and said, "Don't do that again." Yes, sir. And I never did that again. Go into a public school setting these days and see what happens when a teacher tells a kid to do something, and if the kid says, "Why should I do that?" they respond, "Because I said so, I'm the teacher." See how that flies, you know? Because I'm the teacher. Because I'm the parent. Because I'm the preacher. Use your favorite example. Because I'm the doctor. Authority these days does not come from a title or a position so much as it comes by relationship. If a postmodern person thinks that you care about them, they may actually do what you ask them to do. But they won't do it simply on the basis of demand, appealing to the authority of your role. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that is the way it is in the postmodern world. Okay? With me? In the modern world, people related to each other through institutions. So, people related to each other in churches, they related to each other in lodges, they related to each other in bowling leagues. They related to each other in a million different ways, sororities and fraternities. People related to each other through institutions. But in the postmodern era, people, you might say, are sort of skipping that step and relating directly to one another. And one of the problems with that is, of course, that we're not naturally in each other's proximity if we're significantly different from one another. So I can attend Northwood Christian Church, I can attend Central Christian Church, I can attend any church really, and I don't really have to be relating to any young person, even if they're there. I don't have to relate to them. In daily society, there are stores aimed at each generation, so I don't even have to buy my shoes in the same store that a young person might buy their shoes. Because there's a young person's shoe store, and then there's the geezer's shoe store that I go to, you know, where young people don't go. Restaurants I eat in, people that eat in the restaurants I eat in mostly look a lot like me. I don't really care to eat in some of those restaurants where younger people eat. Now, sometimes I do it as a sort of a cross-cultural experience or a cross-generational experience because I want to know who these people are and what they're like. But left to my own designs, I probably wouldn't have a conversation with anybody very different from me for months at a time because I don't have to. We're not put into proximity with each other because we don't relate to each other through organizations that put us together. We relate individually as we choose. In the modern era, there was a broad social consensus. Now, this is a big one for the church. There was a broad social consensus. And that broad social consensus was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant males ruled the world until 1968. And then we began to see serious cracks in that modern world that were run by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, males. If you don't believe this, go back and watch an episode of a TV series that showed in the 1950s. And just pay attention to the attitudes and the interactions between men and women, for example. You won't see much interaction between races because there's only one race on television in the 1950s, by and large. But there's a lot of white people on television, so just notice how men and women relate to each other in the 1950s. And you can begin to see the difference in the way people relate to each other now from then. So there was a broad social consensus. Every board, practically, in every institution in America, other than the Women's Club, was peopled by white males. I went to the athletic club downtown when I was GMP, and I thought I'd play racquetball down there to stay in shape, and which I did until I one day ran Robert Welsh into the wall and broke his wrist, and then there went my routine. But anyway, but I went down there, and the thing that amazed me about the athletic club, and you can see the same thing in the Columbia Club, were the pictures of the annual meetings. First of all, there were hundreds of people in these annual meetings. Second thing you noticed was they were all men, and they were all white. Doesn't matter if you were in the Democratic Club, which was the athletic club, or the Columbia Club, which is the Republican club. Same thing, both places. But as you got to the annual meetings in the 80s and the 90s, and the farther down the road you got, the fewer people appeared in the annual meetings, and the more diversity that began to show up after 1968. Oops, there's a woman. Now there's a woman member in the athletic club. Wow, there's a black person. Maybe that person was working in the kitchen. No, they're actually members. You know? And that diversity began to grow in those pictures after 1968. And the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male grasp on our culture began to loosen just a little bit. Now we still have legislatures that are mostly white males making lots of rules about reproduction and other sexuality issues. That's another subject for another day. But there's a whole lot more variety of opinion now in the society, and people other than white males are standing up and being heard. Of course, some white males can't stand this, so they just choke people like George Floyd to death. That's an extreme case, but not as unusual as we might like to think. So, broad social consensus. Now there's no single consensus. This is great for justice. Everybody has a voice. Most everybody has a place at the table. So now the church board is not just old white guys or old and young white guys. Now it's everybody who's a member of the organization is at the board table and has a voice and can bring their perspective. Great from the standpoint of justice, but boy, does it make institutional life difficult. Because now all of a sudden you've got different opinions that you have to work through to get some kind of consensus to find a way forward. Really hard to do. Most of our voluntary institutions are doing a better job of this than the U.S. government is at the moment. But gone is the days of the white male, the hold on society. Now there is no single social consensus, and there are many voices. Communication in the modern era was formal, and it was indirect. So I remember as a pastor, we're about done, so I'll finish up here in 5 minutes. When I was a pastor of Little Eagle Creek Christian Church, I had a woman in my congregation, a couple in my congregation who were about 90 years old. And I went to see them, and their communication was so formal and so indirect that when we were all three sitting there in the front room, but she would refer to him as the Mr., and he would refer to her as the Mrs. I knew there was no way I was ever going to get them to call me Dick as the pastor. That just wasn't in the cards. But Communication was formal and it was indirect. Today, anybody goes up to anybody and says anything they want to say without regard to their position or anything else, right? I mean, there's limits to that, and those of us who grew up in that time when you showed respect for people because of a category, take offense. I still find it offensive when a 6-year-old I don't know comes up to me and calls me by my first name and asks some question about something that's really none of his business. But that's the postmodern world. No regard for position, no regard for any of that. Communication is informal and direct. By the way, John F. Kennedy had this to a T. When he appeared on television, he was the first political candidate in the United States that really understood what television was. So the people who listened to the Nixon-Kennedy debate on radio most of them thought Nixon had won the debate. But those who watched the debate on television thought Kennedy had won. And that's because Nixon looked uncomfortable in that very direct kind of communication between the two of them on camera. Whereas Kennedy had been schooled, I guess, to understand how television works. So he was cool as a cucumber. So Nixon's sweating, and Kennedy is looking like Kennedy, you know. Okay, finally, in the modern world, progress was considered to be inevitable. Certainly after World War II, everybody thought, boy, the world's just going to get better and better as we figure out every disease and we figure out every problem that's challenging the people of Earth. Eventually, we will have overcome nature, and this will be paradise. Now, the best you can say is, well, progress is possible. Inevitable, not so much. Not so much. So when Martin Luther King said in 1965, was it, 1963, that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, everybody could relate to that because everybody thought things were going to get better and better. But when you say that today, it's kind of a hard sell, frankly, to postmoderns because they're not at all sure that the arc of the universe is increasingly or at any pace bending toward justice. So it's an entirely different view of reality. Next week, we're going to talk about individual generations and how this divides out among those different generations and what the implications of that for church life would be. But let me just tease you this way and say, one of the things that the church has to do, I said earlier, was to reach out into the community in a missional model instead of an attractional model. That's because they're not attracted to your reality as you understand it, by and large. They have a different reality. And in order for you to be able to reach them with the gospel, you've got to understand what their reality is and meet them there, even though it's not your reality. You have to understand it well enough to be able to relate to them in a way that says to them, this person might have something I need to think about. This person might have something I need. This might be a person I would like to relate to and learn from and share with. But if you approach them only on the basis of your own reality, you'll be invisible at best and highly annoying at worst. Okay? So that's what we're going to talk about next week. Is how this plays out generationally. I think you'll find it to be helpful. Thank you for paying attention today. Yes, Doris? Yes. That's right. 70s before women could be elders and the disciples, and before they could wear slacks. If you want to make somebody cry, when I talked to an older disciple woman who was an elder of her church, I asked her what it was like to be the first elder in her congregation. It will bring her to tears, because those people were trailblazers, and the rest of us didn't really understand how much grief they took in that process of becoming the first female elder in their congregation. Something we take for granted now. Yeah. Thanks, Doris. That's a great example. See you next week. God bless you.